The quiet of the Northwood Performing Arts Academy was a living thing. It had a texture, a weight, a smell. It was the scent of old wood, lemon polish, and the faint, dusty perfume of aging velvet curtains. For the woman who pushed the squeaking cleaning cart, this silence was her companion, her canvas. She moved through the grand lobby not like a ghost, as some might imagine, but like a painter retouching a beloved masterpiece. Every night she restored the academy to its original state of pristine perfection, erasing the day's chaos with the rhythmic sweep of her mop and the gentle caress of her dusting cloth. Her world was one of routine, a comforting and predictable sequence of tasks. First, the tall, arched windows wiped until they were invisible sheets of glass, revealing the moonlit gardens outside. Then the bronze statue of the Academy's severe-looking founder, whose polished head she could see her own faint reflection in. She would often pause there, a small, gray-clad figure looking up at the giant, a silent conversation between the cleaner and the creator. But tonight she was behind. A burst pipe in the basement had stolen an hour from her, and the familiar silence was broken. It was being violated by a wave of sound that spilled from the grand rehearsal hall. Laughter, loud and sharp, echoed off the marble floors and climbed the high, vaulted ceiling. It was the sound of confidence, of privilege, of young people who had never known a world that didn't bend to their will. The woman tensed, her shoulders tightening beneath the stiff fabric of her uniform. She preferred the empty building, the space where she could move freely and think her own thoughts. The presence of others made her feel like an intruder in her own kingdom. She pushed her cart towards the far corner of the lobby, trying to make herself smaller, to become just another piece of the furniture. Her goal was to clean the floor around the main attraction, the centerpiece of the lobby that commanded more attention than any statue or painting, the Fazioli concert grand piano. It sat on a small, raised platform, bathed in the warm glow of a single spotlight. Its black, polished finish reflected the room like a dark, still lake. It was a thing of immense beauty and value, a symbol of the art and excellence the Academy cultivated. To her, it was just another surface to be cleaned, but one that required a special kind of care. She had a specific soft cloth for it, one she kept separate from the others, reserved only for this one task. As she got closer, the rehearsal hall doors swung open and the group spilled out. There were 5 of them, students in their late teens or early 20s, dressed in the casual but expensive uniform of the artistically gifted, scarves, faded jeans, and worn leather jackets. They were led by a young man with a swagger in his step and a smile that seemed to take up too much of his face. He was the kind of person who filled any space he entered, not just with his presence but with his voice. Following them was their instructor, a woman with a severe bun and an even more severe expression, who carried a leather-bound portfolio as if it were a shield. The students gathered around the piano, their laughter subsiding into a low murmur of appreciation. The young man ran a hand lovingly over the lid, his fingers tracing the elegant curve. "Just listen to that sustain," he said, his voice booming in the lobby. He pressed a key, and a single, perfect note rang out, vibrating in the air for a long, beautiful moment before fading away. The others nodded in agreement, their faces filled with a shared understanding that excluded the rest of the world. The woman with the cart kept her head down, focusing on her task. She uncoiled the hose from her mop bucket, the sound of the plastic wheels on the marble suddenly seeming very loud. She just needed to clean the area around the platform, and then she could retreat to the safety of the quieter hallways. She began to mop in slow, methodical strokes, the water leaving a dark, glistening path on the pale stone. She was a master of invisibility, a skill she had honed over a decade of working in the shadows of greatness. If you don't make eye contact, if you move with purpose and don't make any sudden moves, you can become part of the scenery, but tonight her invisibility cloak failed her. A voice called out, sharp and clear. It was the young man with the swagger. He was looking right at her. "Hey, cleaning lady!" She froze, her mop handle held tight in her hands. A knot of dread formed in her stomach. She knew what was coming. It was a dance she had experienced before, a clumsy, cruel tango where she was always the one to stumble. The other students turned to look. their expressions shifting from boredom to curiosity. A new form of entertainment had just presented itself. The instructor glanced over, her face a mask of mild annoyance, as if the woman's presence was a minor inconvenience. A smudge on the otherwise perfect evening. The young man walked towards her, his grin widening. He was enjoying this, the power he held in this moment. "You're here every night, aren't you?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "You must know this piano better than anyone." A few of the other students snickered. One of them, a girl with bright red hair, pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. The woman felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and into the basement where she had just spent an hour battling a flood. She said nothing, just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned back to her mopping, hoping the conversation was over, but it was just beginning. "I bet you're a secret prodigy, aren't you?" the young man continued, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I bet you wait until we're all gone, and then you sit down and play Rachmaninoff." The laughter erupted now, full and uninhibited. It was a cruel sound, not joyful, but mocking. They were laughing at the absurdity of the image, her, in her plain gray uniform, with her worn-out shoes and her hands rough from work, sitting at that magnificent instrument. It was a joke to them, a funny little story they could tell their friends later. The woman's grip on the mop handle tightened. Her knuckles were white. She could feel their eyes on her, a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She was not a person to them. She was a character in their impromptu play, the butt of their joke. She wanted to tell them to leave her alone, to just let her do her job. But the words were stuck in her throat, choked by a lifetime of learning to be quiet, to not make a fuss. "Come on, just one song?" the young man pressed, stepping closer. He was now standing between her and her cart, blocking her only escape route. "Show us what you've got. Or can you even play?" He leaned against the piano, a casual, confident pose that was designed to intimidate. "I bet you can't even find middle C." The laughter grew louder. The girl with the red phone was now recording, a small red light glowing in the dim lobby. The woman felt a surge of something hot and sharp, something that broke through her usual wall of quiet resignation. It was a mix of anger and shame and a deep, aching sadness. She looked at the young man's smug face, at the phone pointed in her direction, at the beautiful, gleaming piano that sat silently, as if watching the whole scene unfold, and then she made a decision. It was not a conscious thought, not a carefully weighed choice. It was an instinct, a primal urge to reclaim a small piece of herself, to push back against the tide of their mockery. Without saying a word, she put the mop back in the bucket. The splash of the water was the only sound in the suddenly silent lobby. The laughter had died, replaced by a tense, curious silence. They hadn't expected her to respond. She turned and walked slowly, deliberately, towards the piano. Her steps were quiet on the marble, her gray uniform a stark contrast to the elegant, dark wood of the instrument. The students watched, their smug smiles replaced by looks of surprise and anticipation. They were still waiting for the punchline, for the clumsy fumble, the discordant note that would end their little game and give them their victory. But as she approached the piano, something shifted in the air. The woman's posture changed. The slight stoop in her shoulders straightened. Her gaze, which had been fixed on the floor, was now locked on the keys. She was no longer the quiet, invisible cleaner. She was something else entirely. She reached the piano and stood before it, a silent, powerful figure in the dim light. The lobby was so quiet you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. She raised her hands, not to play but to remove her work gloves. And in that moment, no one was laughing anymore. The air in the lobby grew thick and heavy, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. The young man's confident smirk was still plastered on his face, but it was starting to look a little brittle, a little forced. He had expected a quick surrender, a mumbled "no thank you," and then he and his friends could move on, their little victory secure. But the woman standing before the piano was not surrendering. She was preparing for a battle, and the silence was her first weapon. Her fingers, still encased in the thin gray rubber of her work gloves, found the edge of the glove on her right hand. She began to peel it back slowly, methodically. The soft, snapping sound it made as it pulled away from her skin seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. It was a sound that demanded attention. Every eye was fixed on her hands. The girl with the red phone had lowered it slightly, her expression one of confused curiosity. This wasn't going the way she had planned. The funny video was turning into something else, something she couldn't quite name. The glove came off completely, and she held it in her left hand for a moment before letting it drop silently to the floor. It lay there like a shed skin, a small, gray, discarded thing. Her bare hand was revealed. It wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't a normal hand. It was a hand that told a story, a long and difficult one. Her fingers weren't straight and elegant like the young man's, the ones he had so casually run across the piano keys. They were twisted like the branches of an old, hardy tree that had survived too many harsh winters. Some of them were bent at odd angles, frozen in positions that looked painful. Two of her smaller fingers on that hand seemed to be fused together, grown into a single, stiff digit that could never move on its own. The skin over her knuckles was tight and shiny, stretched thin over swollen joints that looked like small, hard pebbles under her flesh. It was a hand that looked like it had been in a fight, a long fight that it had ultimately lost. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the group of students. The mockery that had been so ripe in the air just moments before vanished, replaced by a sudden, uncomfortable wave of pity and shame. The young man's face went pale. The smirk was gone, erased by a look of dawning horror. He saw, for the first time, not a character in his little game, but a person. A person who lived with a reality he couldn't even begin to imagine. He opened his mouth to say something, to apologize, to tell her it was just a joke, but the words caught in his throat. It was too late. The joke had curdled into something ugly and cruel, and he was the one holding the bag, the instructor, who had been watching from a distance with an air of detached disapproval, now took a step forward. Her professional eyes saw not just the deformity, but the history behind it. She recognized the signs of severe, chronic arthritis, the kind that ravages the body and steals away its simplest functions. She felt a pang of guilt for not stopping her students sooner, but the woman seemed oblivious to their reactions. Her focus was entirely internal. She was not looking for their pity or their sympathy. She was simply showing them the truth. She slowly, deliberately began to remove the glove from her left hand. The same process, the same slow peel, the same soft snap. This hand, if anything, was in a worse state. Her wrist was stiff and seemed locked in a slightly bent position. Her thumb was pulled in tight against her palm, unable to oppose the other fingers. It was a hand that couldn't grip, couldn't hold a cup, couldn't button a shirt. It was a hand that couldn't play the piano. The second glove joined the first on the floor. There they were, her two hands, exposed under the bright spotlight. They were a testament to pain, to a life of struggle. They were the hands of a fighter, but a fighter who had been dealt an impossible hand. The lobby was now completely silent. The only sound was the low, almost imperceptible hum of the building's ventilation system. The students stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment. They were no longer a pack of arrogant predators. They were just a group of kids who had been shown a glimpse of a world much harder than their own. The girl with the red phone had put it away completely, the screen dark. There was nothing here worth recording anymore. The woman looked at her own hands for a moment, as if seeing them for the first time herself. Then she looked up at the young man who had challenged her. Her eyes were not angry. They were not sad. They were just clear. They held a depth of quiet strength that was more intimidating than any show of anger could ever be. In that look he saw a lifetime of being stared at, a lifetime of being underestimated, a lifetime of finding ways to do things that everyone else said were impossible. She turned her attention back to the piano. The students and the instructor watched, holding their breath. What was she going to do? She couldn't possibly play. It was a physical impossibility. The expectation now was not that she would fail, but that she would simply stand there, a silent, tragic figure. They were waiting for her to turn away, to pick up her gloves, and to retreat back into the shadows from which she came, but she didn't. She took a small step closer to the piano. She leaned forward, her movements slow and measured. And then she did the last thing anyone expected. She raised her hands and brought them down towards the keys. But she didn't try to place her fingertips on the ivories. She couldn't. Instead, she positioned her hands in a way that was both strange and ingenious. She rested the heel of her right hand on the lower keys, her twisted fingers curled over the edge. With her left hand, she used the side of her palm, her locked thumb providing a point of pressure. It was not a traditional piano technique. It was not a technique at all. It was a personal adaptation, a unique way of communicating with the instrument born out of sheer necessity. Her hands, which looked so broken and useless, had found their own way to make music. And in that moment, as she settled her hands onto the keys, the onlookers weren't looking at a disability anymore. They were looking at a solution. They were about to hear a song that could only be played by hands like hers. The lobby was a vacuum, a space devoid of air, of sound, of time itself. Every person in that grand room was frozen, their bodies locked in a tableau of disbelief. The woman's hands, those twisted, gnarled things that had inspired such pity moments before, now rested on the pristine ivory keys of the fazioli. It was an image of impossibility, a defiance of logic. The young man who had taunted her felt his own breath catch in his chest, a painful, tight knot. He wanted to look away, to erase the scene he had created, but his eyes were glued to her hands. He was a prisoner of his own cruelty, and then it began. There was no delicate press of a fingertip, no graceful arpeggio. The first sound was not a note, but a feeling. It was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to rise up from the very floorboards, a vibration that settled in their bones. She had used the heel of her right hand, pressing down firmly on a cluster of low bass notes. The sound was not a clang or a thud. It was a profound, sonorous chord like the sigh of a sleeping giant. It was a sound that spoke of weight, of substance, of something ancient and powerful. It filled the vast space of the lobby, pushing against the high ceiling and the distant walls, claiming the room as its own. For a moment, there was only that single, sustained sound. It hung in the air, a dark, rich tapestry of vibration. The students stood motionless, their expressions of pity and shame slowly melting away, replaced by something new, confusion. This was not the sound of failure. This was not the sound of a joke gone wrong. This was the sound of intention. Then her other hand moved. Her left hand, with its fused fingers and locked thumb, came down on the middle register of the keyboard. She didn't use her fingertips. She used the side of her palm, her knuckles, striking the keys with a motion that was both a caress and a percussive strike. The notes that emerged were clear and bell-like, a stark, beautiful contrast to the deep hum that still resonated from the bass. It was like a single bird singing over a dark, stormy sea. The young man felt his mouth fall open slightly. His mind was struggling to process what he was hearing. It didn't make sense. The physics of it were all wrong. He had spent years learning the proper technique, the correct posture, the precise way to curve his fingers to achieve the perfect tone. He knew, with absolute certainty, that you could not make a beautiful sound by hitting a piano with your palm. And yet, that was exactly what was happening. The woman's hands began a slow, deliberate dance across the keys. It was a dance of necessity, a unique choreography born from limitation. Her right hand would press a deep, somber chord with her palm, while her left hand would tap out a fragile, hesitant melody with her knuckles. Then, her right hand would shift, the heel of her hand sliding up the keyboard to create a new foundation, while the side of her left hand would sweep down, producing a cascade of notes like falling rain. She wasn't playing the piano in the way he understood it. She was partnershiping with it. She was finding a way to make it sing with the only tools she had. The music began to tell a story. It was a story of struggle. There was no mistaking that. There were passages that were filled with a tense, dissonant harmony, notes that clashed and fought against each other, creating a feeling of anxiety and frustration. During these moments, her movements became more forceful. her hands striking the keys with a barely contained anger that seemed to echo a lifetime of being misunderstood, of being told you can't. The instructor, a woman who had dedicated her life to the theory and practice of music, felt a shiver run down her spine. She was listening to a raw, unfiltered emotion being translated directly into sound. It was more complex and more honest than anything she had ever heard in a concert hall, but then the mood would shift. A melody would emerge from the chaos, a simple, hauntingly beautiful line of notes that seemed to hold a flicker of hope. It was a tune that spoke of quiet resilience, of finding beauty in unexpected places. When she played this melody, her touch would become lighter, her movements more fluid. It was as if she was cradling the sound, protecting it from the harshness of the world. The girl with the red hair, who had been so eager to capture a moment of humiliation, now found herself mesmerized. She wasn't seeing a disabled woman trying to play a piano. She was seeing an artist expressing a truth so profound it transcended the need for perfect fingers. The young man could no longer stand. He slowly, unconsciously, sank to the marble floor, sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest. He felt small, insignificant. The music was washing over him, cleansing him of his arrogance, his ignorance, his cruelty. Every note was a reminder of his foolishness. He had seen her hands and seen only brokenness. He had seen her uniform and seen only a station in life. He had seen her silence and mistaken it for emptiness. Now he was hearing the truth. Her hands were not broken. They were just different. Her uniform was just a piece of clothing. And her silence was not empty. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be filled with sound. The music began to build in intensity. The simple melody grew, becoming more complex, more insistent. The deep bass chords became more frequent, like a steady, determined heartbeat. Her hands moved with a surprising speed and grace, a flurry of palms and knuckles that created a storm of sound. It was a storm of emotion, of pain and triumph, of loss and love. The music filled every corner of the lobby. It seemed to seep into the very walls, into the marble floors, into the bronze statue of the founder. The entire building was listening. The students were no longer a group of individuals. They had become a single audience, united in their awe. They had forgotten who they were, where they were. There was no popular kid, no quiet one, no prodigy, no slacker. There were only listeners. Their faces were turned towards the piano, their eyes wide, their bodies completely still. Some had tears streaming down their faces, unaware they were even crying. The instructor stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her own professional composure shattered. Her heart lay bare by the raw power of the music. The woman at the piano was lost in her own world. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if she were listening to a voice that only she could hear. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm, a picture of complete concentration and surrender. She was not thinking about the people watching her, about the judgment they had passed, about the shock they now felt. She was just playing. She was finally able to speak, and her language was music. The song reached its peak, a crescendo of sound that was both heartbreaking and exhilarating, a sound that held all the joy and all the sorrow of a lifetime. It was the sound of a soul laid bare. And in that moment, everyone who heard it was changed forever. The storm of sound that had filled the lobby reached its peak. It was a wave of emotion so powerful, so overwhelming, that it felt like it might shatter the very windows of the academy. The woman's hands moved with a fierce, desperate energy, a flurry of palms and knuckles striking the keys, not in violence but in a passionate plea. The deep bass chords rumbled like a distant, angry thunder, while the melodies, played with the sides of her hands, soared like birds caught in the storm, fighting for every inch of sky. It was the sound of a life lived on the edge, a sound of pain that had been carved into something beautiful, a sound of a spirit that refused to be broken. The students were no longer just listening. They were experiencing it. The music was a physical force, pushing against them, filling their lungs, making their hearts beat in time with its frantic, powerful rhythm. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm began to calm. The furious energy subsided, the complex chords simplified, and the frantic melody softened. The music transitioned into a new phase, a gentle, quiet resolution. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long and terrible rain. The notes she played now were simple, clear, and filled with a sense of peace. It was not the peace of surrender, but the peace of acceptance, of understanding. The struggle was over. The battle had been fought. And in the quiet that followed, there was only a profound and lingering sense of grace. Her hands slowed their dance, the movements becoming smaller, more delicate. She played a final, simple melody, a line of notes that seemed to hang in the air like glowing embers. It was a tune of heartbreaking beauty, full of a quiet sadness, but also a deep, unshakable strength. It was a farewell. And then, with the last note of that melody, she brought her hands down one last time, not with a strike, but with a gentle press. She used the heel of her hand and the base of her thumb to form a single, perfect chord. It was a sound of completeness, of finality. She held the chord, letting it resonate, filling the lobby with one last, breathtaking wave of sound. And then she lifted her hands from the keys. The silence that followed was unlike any silence they had ever known. It was not an empty silence. It was a full, heavy, living silence. It was filled with the ghost of the music that had just been played, with the echoes of the emotions that had been poured into the room. The air seemed to vibrate with the memory of the sound. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. They were all trapped in the weight of that moment, their minds and hearts struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The young man who had started it all remained on the floor, his knees pulled to his chest. Staring at the woman's back as if she were a religious apparition, the woman herself stood perfectly still for a long moment, her hands resting on the wooden lip of the piano. Her head was still bowed, her eyes closed. She seemed to be gathering herself, pulling her soul back from the place where it had been soaring. She was not looking for applause. She was not looking for praise. She had not been playing for them. She had been playing for herself, for the little girl she once was, for the life she had lived, for the pain she had endured. The audience was incidental. Their shock, their awe, their transformation was a byproduct of her expression, not the goal of it. Slowly, she straightened up. She turned away from the piano and looked down at the floor, where her two gray gloves lay like small, forgotten animals. She bent down, a slow, careful movement, and picked them up. She took her time putting them back on, pulling the soft rubber over her twisted fingers, covering up the story her hands told. As each glove snapped into place, it was like she was putting on her armor again. Retreating back into the invisible, quiet person she was supposed to be, the instructor was the first to move. But it was only a small, almost imperceptible shift. She raised a hand to her chest, as if to still her own heart, which was beating a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had spent her entire life teaching music. She had taught theory, technique, history. She had taught students how to read notes, how to position their hands, how to play with precision and skill. But in all her years, in all her studies, in all the concerts she had attended, she had never been taught what she had just learned. She had been teaching the mechanics of music, the science of sound. This woman had just shown her the soul of it. Technique was the map, but this was the destination. She realized with a sudden, jarring clarity that everything she thought she knew about music was incomplete. She had been so focused on the notes that she had forgotten about the space between them, the silence, the breath, the life. The girl with the red hair stood with her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. But she wasn't cold. She was burning with a feeling she couldn't name. She had come into this lobby looking for a cheap laugh, a moment of entertainment at someone else's expense. She had left with a lesson in humanity. The phone in her pocket felt like a lead weight, a reminder of the person she was just an hour ago. She understood now that some things were not meant to be recorded, not meant to be shared in a 10-second clip. Some things were meant to be felt, to be experienced in the moment, to be carried in your heart. The music had changed her. It had opened her eyes to a world of depth and feeling she had never known existed. Finally, it was the young man who broke the spell. He slowly, carefully pushed himself up from the floor. His legs felt weak, his knees shaky. He was no longer the confident, arrogant leader of the pack. He was just a boy who had been humbled, who had been shown the depth of his own ignorance. He walked towards the woman, his steps hesitant, uncertain, as if he were walking on sacred ground. The other students watched him, their eyes wide, holding their breath. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to see the tired lines around her eyes, the faint silver strands in her hair. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to say something, anything to make it right. But the words were gone. All the clever, witty things he had ever said in his life had vanished, leaving behind only a raw, aching emptiness. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw not a janitor, not a disabled person, not a victim. He saw an artist. He saw a master. He saw a person who had taken the broken pieces of her life and had built something beautiful out of them. He had learned to play the piano with his fingers. She had learned to play it with her life. And in that moment he understood the true meaning of strength. He didn't say he was sorry. The words were too small, too insignificant for what he was feeling. Instead, he just stood there, his eyes filled with tears, and he said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." The woman stopped putting on her second glove. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and calm. She saw not the bully who had mocked her, but the boy who had been changed by her music. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a simple acknowledgement of his words. Then she finished pulling on her glove, turned, and walked back to her cleaning cart, leaving the group of students standing in the silent, music-filled lobby, forever changed by the woman who had shown them that the most beautiful songs don't always come from the most perfect hands. The woman walked away from the piano, her gray uniform once again her shield, her identity. The soft squeak of her cart's wheels was the only sound that broke the heavy silence that had fallen over the lobby. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The music had said everything she needed to say. For her, the moment was over. It was a release, a catharsis, a conversation with a part of herself she rarely let others see. Now it was time to return to her world, the world of quiet routines and invisible labor. The students, the instructor, the grand piano, they were all part of a different world. A world she had visited for just a few breathtaking minutes, but for the people she left behind, the world would never be the same. They remained frozen in her wake, like statues left in the path of a tidal wave. The silence she left behind was not empty. It was filled with questions, with awe, with a crushing sense of shame. The young man who had provoked her still stood where she had left him, his face a canvas of regret. He looked at his own hands, the hands he had been so proud of, the hands that could play Chopin and Liszt with technical perfection. They suddenly seemed clumsy, soulless, like tools that knew how to do a job but had no understanding of why. He had learned to play the piano with his fingers. She had learned to play it with her life. The instructor was the first to move, but her movements were slow, uncertain. She dismissed her students with a soft, distracted wave of her hand. There would be no more lessons tonight. There was nothing left she could teach them that would compare to what they had just learned. She watched them go, their usual chatter and laughter replaced by a quiet, solemn shuffle. They left as different people than they had arrived. The girl with the red hair was the last to go, pausing at the door to look back at the empty piano, a look of profound wonder on her face. The instructor remained in the lobby long after the students had gone. She walked over to the fazioli and stood where the woman had stood. She looked at the keys, imagining the impossible placement of the twisted hands, the heels of the palms, the knuckles. She reached out her own perfectly formed, technically proficient hand and then pulled it back, as if she were afraid to touch the keys, afraid that her touch would somehow tarnish the magic that had just occurred. She realized, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that she had been a fraud. She had been teaching the how of music for decades, but she had forgotten the why. She had been so focused on training fingers that she had neglected to nurture souls. That night she didn't sleep. The haunting melody replayed in her mind, a constant, poignant reminder of everything she had missed, The next day, the woman was back at work, pushing her cart through the silent hallways as if nothing had happened. For her, it hadn't. It was a moment and moments pass, but the world had shifted around her. As she was polishing the bronze statue, she heard a hesitant footstep behind her. It was the young man. He was out of his usual swaggering clothes, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. He looked smaller, younger. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual arrogance. The woman turned, her expression neutral. She had already moved on, but he was still trapped in the previous night. I don't know how to say what I want to say," he stammered, looking at the floor. What we did, it was horrible. I am so sorry." He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a genuine, painful sincerity. "What you played, it changed something in me. I've been playing since I was 5, and I thought I was good. But I don't know anything. You play with more heart in one note than I have in my entire body." The woman watched him, her expression unreadable. She saw not a bully, but a broken boy trying to piece himself back together. She gave a small, slow nod. It was not forgiveness, but acceptance. It was enough. He took a deep breath, as if a great weight had been lifted from his chest. Can I help you?" he asked, gesturing to her cleaning supplies. "Just for a little while. It's the least I can do." And so, the academy's most promising piano student spent the next hour helping the janitor polish the railings. His hands, which had been praised by maestros, now learning the humble task of cleaning up after others. In the weeks that followed, the story of the night in the lobby became a kind of legend at the academy. It was passed from student to student, not as a funny anecdote, but as a sacred text. The instructor, fueled by a newfound purpose, went to the academy's board of directors with a radical proposal. She didn't want to just praise the woman. She wanted to honor her by creating something lasting. She proposed a new scholarship, a new program, dedicated to what she called adaptive artistry. It would be for students who, like the woman, had physical challenges that prevented them from learning an instrument in a traditional way. The program's focus would not be on overcoming limitations, but on finding unique ways to make music within them. It would be about innovation, about heart, about the why. The board, initially skeptical, was moved by the instructor's passion and the story that inspired it. They approved the program. The next step was to approach the woman. The instructor, along with the young man, found her in the cafeteria during her break. They explained their idea about the scholarship, about how her music could inspire others. They wanted to name it after her. They wanted her to be a part of it, a guest lecturer, a guide. The woman was quiet for a long time. She was a private person, and the idea of being in the spotlight was uncomfortable. She had never asked for recognition. "I am not a teacher," she said softly. "I am just a cleaner." "No," the instructor said, her voice firm but kind. "You are a musician, and you have more to teach us than we have a lifetime to learn." The young man nodded in agreement, his eyes pleading. It was the look in his eyes, the look of someone who had been truly changed, that finally convinced her. She agreed, not for the fame or the honor, but for the possibility that her experience might help someone else feel less alone. Months later, the first class of the Adaptive Artistry Scholarship began. It was a small group of students, a young girl with a prosthetic arm, a boy who was blind, another who had limited use of his hands. And at the front of the room, standing not at a piano but in front of it, was the woman. She was not in her uniform, but in a simple blue dress. She was not teaching them notes or scales. She was teaching them how to listen. "The music is not in the keys," she told them, her voice quiet but clear. "It is in you. You just have to find your own way to let it out." She showed them how she had found her way, not with shame, but with a simple, matter-of-fact honesty. In the back of the room, the young man sat, not as a prodigy, but as an assistant, his eyes filled with a humility and respect that had reshaped his entire world. The woman had not become a famous concert pianist. She had become something much more. She had become a teacher, a guide, a living testament to the idea that the most beautiful music doesn't come from perfect hands, but from a determined, unbreakable heart. And in the quiet of that classroom, surrounded by students who had been told you can't, she had finally found her true stage.